debate project that we are currently doing at the Institute Design Prote, so the debate organization in Slovenia. So we'll be talking about debate and philosophy typology, basically intersection of philosophy and debate in action. We'll be talking about some philosophical concepts, then we'll do some other things and apply them to the debate. So the point being that this part of the project is about, how philosophy can have debate. For some of you, next week we will also talk about how debate can be included in philosophy classes. I'm not sure if all of you will be there, but some of you might be. Cool, so what we will do, 4 things today. First, we will talk about freedom, some conceptions of freedom, some very basic philosophical theories of freedom. Then secondly, we will start working on a motion together and we'll just brainstorm together and start to make a case. Then we have a long bench exercise, I will do that later. And then last thing we will talk about is POIs. So how to use POIs, again connecting back to philosophy as well, and we'll do some exercises all throughout. So basically, the first part is me speaking, the other parts are you speaking, and we will do that in turn. Let's start with what you guys want to define freedom as. What do you guys think of when we talk about freedom? Obviously trying to tie things with the principles in debate or in general. I don't know how many of you do philosophy. So general, what if I ask you what freedom is, what would you say? And that's an open-ended question for everyone.
The ability to make personal choices based on your free will.
Okay, personal choices based on your free will. Okay, any other takes?
Not being limited by some external influences.
Okay, cool. Okay, what else? What can be free of, free from, free to? What can all those different things entail? Anything else than those 2 things that already captured?
Maybe authority or like some like institution or someone with power to put those limits on you.
Okay, so we are talking about authorities here. Anything else? Anything beyond those 2 things? Okay, so I think that what those 2 things generally take into account and what they already describe is what we would generally term philosophically negative freedom, right? So negative freedom essentially is freedom without external constraints, as Una mentioned already, right? So it's about you not having someone imposing limits on you. This is one way of freedom, right? So we are free when no one interferes with us, when no one says what we are supposed to do. So, for example, the example of negative freedom that is usually used in discussions, in political discussions, in debate as well, is like property rights are usually defined in terms of negative freedom, right? So we have a right to use our wealth, use our money, use our property in any way we think fit, because no one should interfere with those rights. Thus, we are free to have property, thus we are free to have property rights in the first place. So this is one version of freedom. And usually when we discuss freedom and in debate, this one obviously does come handy, but it's just one of the 3. So what would be another layer of freedom? So if we say we are free to do X, what other things can we say that we are not free? In what sense, right? So, positive freedom. Does anyone have any idea what positive freedom might be? Any takers? Okay, so one part, as I mentioned, is external constraints. So I can be free to work, right? And no one can say in that sense, if we deploy negative freedom, that I shouldn't work as X, or that so that I should be a plumber, right? No one can say that. This is my negative freedom. But what's the positive freedom? The positive freedom is the aspect when you need to then have the actual capacity to do what you choose, right? So freedom has the capacity to act. Right? So it means that I can be free to desire, to do whatever I want under negative freedom, but this doesn't mean that I'm actually free because I cannot do those things. So for example, I might be free to travel, but if I don't have money, obviously my freedom is very limited. So in this sense, positive freedom captures our capacity to do things and is one way of describing freedom and is a different approach than negative freedom. So it's a more substantive approach. So you would also hear like materialist conception of freedom, substantive approach to freedom and rights, in terms that the rights are not only protections against other people's influence, but they are also there to allow you to do certain things, right? So I have here an example of voting rights, because voting rights generally seen as something that we consider in terms of negative freedom, right? So I'm free to vote for whoever I want, right, in democracy. We all agree with that premise, right? Cool. But then the second question is, for example, if we talk about the United States of America, right? Can I actually vote? Can I actually cast the vote if I live in a certain neighborhood where, a polling station might be moved out of your area, and you suddenly cannot effectively vote anymore, because in order to vote, you need to stand in a line for like 8 hours, which by the way is something that does actually happen, because, America. But at the end of the day, right, this is about positive freedom as well. Because we need to be able to actually vote for this freedom to make sense in the first place, or this rights to make sense in the first place. So this is the positive freedom aspect, right? Anything unclear until this point? Cool. Okay, then we have the third concept of freedom, which is Republican freedom, which takes a step a bit further away. So the first notion of freedom talks about external constraints. The second one talks about like capabilities to actually enact things that we want to do. But the third one is about something that's not necessarily about constraints, but it's rather about more general feeling that you should be free in terms of not being dominated. Right? So I think it sounds highly abstract and it's hard to like materialize it. Generally, what I would say here though is that you need to be free from excessive influence of someone else, because that influence in itself is a bad thing. But I think a good example of that is slavery, right? So in slavery, you can be unfree in two different ways. You can be unfree in terms that you have a bad master, right? So the one who owns the slave can be a cruel, abusive master. They can beat the slave up every day. They can do all of the horrendous things slave masters used to do. And that's a very obvious case of why slavery is bad, right? But a different approach might be, what about people who had slaves and treated them well? Is slavery morally, not about freedom then? If someone acts well and doesn't constrain your freedom, but has a chance to, right? Because slave masters can legally, at any moment, decide that they will limit your freedom. They might not choose to do so, so they might never say you should do X, you can do whatever you want, but they always have this chance to do so. And this is what freedom as non-domination is about. So it's about the fact that you are not really free if you actually have someone who lurks over you, who can at any point decide that what you're doing is not what you should be doing, and that can impose those external constraints on you that we talked about under negative freedom. So this is what freedom as non-domination as a concept is, right? So we want to keep that in mind. So freedom is not non-domination. It means that no one should hold outside influence over your actions, over your decisions and so on, in order for you to actually be free, right? So this is what the three most general concepts of freedom are. I think it's pretty simple on this very basic level. Obviously there exists like a plethora of philosophical books written about any of those, and there is like way more nuance to it. But in general, if we generalize a bit, we can talk about freedom as freedom from negative external constraints, negative freedom. We can talk about positive freedom, or capacity to act. And lastly, we can talk about freedom as non-domination, so that no one can hold things over us. So, linking philosophy to debate, right? I think we should start with talking about principled arguments. I think that this is something that in my experience, usually it's one of the things that's hard to get a good grasp on, especially for beginners. And I think that this is something that, well, at least I notice when I judge debates, that it's the debaters struggle with quite a lot, even at more advanced levels, because we kind of don't talk about this as explicitly as we probably would want to talk about. So, principled arguments in a general sense are arguments about values, are arguments about principles, essentially, that we want to defend in a certain debate position. So, for example, if we have a motion, this house believes that a feminist movement should exclude all male members, so that feminist movement should be exclusively for women, right? So, this is a motion that we debate at some point, and this is something that we can approach. And a principled argument here just asks, is it justified to do so? And in what ways can we justify this? So for example, one way could be saying that, you know, women need safe spaces. The movement is there for women in the first place. We want to encourage those things, so women must be protected. Thus we must, or thus we are just in excluding men in the first place. On the other hand, in opposition, obviously, we talk here about the question of why is it unfair. So explaining, for example, that feminism is not is seeking liberation of gender norms and women in general, and this includes also, you know, bringing men into the coalition and all of those things. In terms of principle itself, right? So that we need men in there because this is what we are fighting about for a society where gender doesn't play a main role. But we are all liberated in that sense, so men shouldn't be excluded. So principles are these types of arguments, justification arguments. And there are like two ways in which I think, you know, philosophy in general, and what we were just talking about, comes in handy when we talk about debate. So first thing, which I think is quite obvious, we can contest the principles through the use of different conceptions of the same concept. Right? So, you know, one side might explain freedom as negative freedom. For example, if the motion is, you know, we will talk about other examples later, but if we talk about motion, this house believes that all inheritance should be taxed 100%. Okay, so what could Timon proposition run as a principal argument? If we are defending that we should, you know, take away everyone's wealth, what type of a concept of freedom might we use? What can we say? Any ideas?
I mean, if we're talking about, for example, the richer population who will probably inherit a lot of money they didn't like work for, it could be about the Republican freedom because they have power over people with that money, or it could be about positive freedom because there's a lot of people who don't have capabilities to do certain things because they don't like have the money to do so, and then those taxes would also help those people.
Yeah, right. So I think that Dasha taps into what would, you know, what most propositions are here, which is firstly, you know, this is about freedom is non-domination. Great wealth imbalances are something that leads to inherent domination because it means that some people have a lot of money, that money can be abused for political purposes, and also it just negatively impacts the power relations in the society in general, right? Because the concept of freedom is non-domination is essentially about power relations. The second thing Dasha also says, which is, you know, positive freedom, also applies here when essentially you want at the end of the day, you know, to benefit the rest of them, that this is about material rights that need to be realized. So for example, saying that, you know, housing is a human right, and this is a way how we can address that. Or in general, if we talk about wealth, how some people, you know, might not be able to live through their rights, that they are formally recognized, right? Because when you're poor, you might have a lot of formally recognized rights in terms of negative freedom. You might have a right, like I said, to travel, but you cannot realize those rights unless you have the material basis for it, unless you have the money actually necessary to do so. So, okay, so on opposition, how can we use those different theories of freedom to contest this Dasha's argument? What can we talk? I mean, I think it's pretty straightforward. Who wants to say it? We talked about three of them, so.
In terms of property rights, so
Yes.
not negative freedom.
Okay, how would you justify that then?
Like these individuals earn this money themselves, so consequently the government or the state does not have the right to take that away on the premise of their death because they choose to someone for this money to inherit.
Yeah. Right, so I think this is a very basic argument, you will hear it a lot in debates. I think Nita explains it well when she says that, you know, this is about you being able to do with your own money, which came from your own work, whatever you want to do. This is why the society should not take away that from you. This is why it's justified for you to give it to whoever you decide when you die. Right? And I think this is one way how this is useful. Right? So, lots of times debaters try to negate principles in terms of they try to show that the logic is flawed, right? So instead of arguing like what we did right now, you would probably go to the argument and probably try to find mistakes or gaps in logic, right? And sometimes it's hard to do so. Because usually principles are well constructed, especially when we have more advanced debates, and then it's usually very hard to win the debate on just trying to take the principle out, just trying to negate it. In that case, contestation of principle by proposing a different interpretation is something that is useful and beneficial, and it's something that at the end of the day, might make it easier for you guys to just engage with it. And yeah, I think the second thing that's important here, is just generally challenge the understanding, and you need to be very explicit about it, obviously. So tell me that you understand this differently, explain how you understand those rights or concepts differently. You can back it up with philosophical theory, as we just did in this case. Yeah, so another example. This was to nationalize all unoccupied residential buildings. And it takes. Anyone wants to start? Proposition.
Here once again, you can talk about negative freedom, and about the fact that a lot of people have the right to buy homes, but don't have the funds to do so, and because people are hoarding those buildings that they're not using, the prices of other buildings go up, and so they can't exercise their freedom to buy houses or something.
Okay, that's one way of doing it. So, so essentially what Dasha is talking about here, on proposition, you talk about positive freedom. So you tell that some rights are not able to be realized here. And on the other hand, in opposition, you talk about negative freedom, where you talk how no one should interfere with your actions in the first place. I think that here what's important, though, Dasha doesn't really take the principle to the full logic on the proposition. Because it's not, so what is the problem about not having housing? About having unoccupied residential buildings, why should we nationalize it? Dasha says some rights are not given. Which rights? What are we talking about?
I mean, the right to own a home, that's what I would talk about. I would talk about people who cannot afford to buy homes, and about how there's not enough homes in the first place.
So it's right to housing, right?
Yeah.
So we need to be very explicit about that, that's my point, right? You want to say, and you want to give me reasons why housing is part of your freedom. Explain to me why it's important to have housing, how it comes with your general security feelings, because you have a home, how you're not worried about where you're going to sleep next night, things like that. This is what is important here, so be careful that you don't start principles a few steps into the analysis. Start them at the beginning. You need to explain what you think you're defending is important. Why is it a part of freedom? And then utilize those different conceptions of freedom for your own gains. Okay, second thing. I think the second way in which it can help is in terms of case building, right? Because usually what we look at in principles, or what we commonly see in principles, is just one idea of how to construct a certain side of the argument. So for example, as we talk right now, you hear about positive freedom in the motion we talked about, so this house will nationalize all unoccupied residential buildings. So I think in lots of cases, there is actually more than one way of building a principle, and it might come up handy if you just combine those different ways. So, we have voting rights here again. So, if we are trying to think about three different conceptions of freedom, in what ways can we talk about voting rights? So we talked about negative part of voting rights, which is just no one should interfere with your right to vote. The second part is you need to have a material way to actually vote, and you need to have a chance to actually cast a ballot. What's the third way of thinking? And there are probably more than just three ways. But what's another layer that we can think about voting rights? So to make your voting rights or right to or being free to vote, what makes it meaningful? What's the third dimension?
You get to choose the authority that is under authority.
Yes, so Nika says choosing authority, and we can rephrase that, I think that one died. We can rephrase that about talking instead of, not only about positive and negative terms, but also that your vote must matter, right? Because this is what Nika talked about. She says that, you need to cast a ballot. This then means that you get to choose the authority. So it doesn't only matter that you have the chance to do it, it doesn't only matter that no one interferes with that chance, but it also matters that it is actually influential in a way, right? So in this way, if you had to defend in an argument or explain why voting rights are crucial or different ways in which voting rights can be constrained, there are multiple ways of thinking about it, and philosophy can help with that if you are able to develop those things. Cool. Any questions at this point before we move on? Okay. So this this is the first of the 4 parts when you guys can leave if you have to, just let me know. Okay, so the next step, what we're gonna do, we have a motion that we debated, it was 3 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. So this house would ban the practice of importing brides. So in the slide, bride importing is when a man agrees to marry a woman and sponsor immigration into this country in exchange for her agreeing to marry. Right? So, you know, another expression you might have heard is mail order brides, right? So this is what the motion is about. So it's about banning this practice. So what we want to do now is first, is there anything unclear about the motion? Is there any questions about the info slide? Do we all know what we're talking about? Cool. Okay, so take 4 minutes, brainstorm, and let's think about potential principled arguments in the debate. And then the second thing that I want you guys to think about is how do those principled arguments inform our choices when we construct a consequentialist arguments. So simply, I just want you guys to think, if we choose a particular principle, what we want to focus on when we are developing our consequentialist arguments. Right? Because our principles usually tell us what are the things that are most important in the debate. Because if we talk about freedom as, you know, non-interference, we are obviously concerned about external constraints. So we probably want to focus on that, show on the harms of external constraints as well. If you think about freedom as, you know, non-domination, they want to show harms of the domination in the first place. Right? So those principles and those things we think about in the first place can help us with showing us what is strategically the most important to run in terms of consequentialist arguments. So let's take 4 minutes, I will set the timer, and then we will start the discussion. Okay, so 4 minutes are up. So let's start with ideas. And I want to hear from someone in the back end first. So what did you think about? So whichever side, what are your beginning ideas about principles? Yeah?
On the opposition side, we could say that a family might force a woman to marry so they could financially benefit.
Okay, yeah. So this is a consequential argument, right?
Yeah.
Is it?
Maybe it's a consequence, so that the family benefits from the forced marriage.
Yeah, okay, that was a test. And yes, I think it's correct. So I think that, so this is a consequentialist argument. So yeah, I think that this is certainly something that you want to argue. I think that this is something that we can talk about when we talk about consequences. And this is something that we will tie in back after we talk about principles. Other ideas, maybe about principles on the last row. What do you have? So come on, what do we say on opposition? So if we are talking about, you know, women signing an agreement or agreeing to marry a man because they sponsor their immigration into the country. So for example, we're talking about green cards. I'll tell you in a second. So, you know, this is what we are talking about. So women sign a contract, they agree to certain conditions, and then they have to fulfill those conditions. And we are talking about the principles of that. Yes, go ahead.
You know about, I think it's a show called, 90 Days Fiancé or something.
Yes?
And it's basically when people use like this marriage as sort of a way to immigrate into a certain country.
Yeah. So, yeah, this is what they're talking about, right?
Yeah.
So, give me a principle for either of the sides. What would you say? Why that's principally justified or why that's principally unjustified?
Honestly, this is unjustified.
Okay.
Because it's not okay. It's basically taking advantage of a person for your own benefit.
Okay, why are you taking advantage? So, you know, a woman agreed freely to marry you and, you know, do whatever comes with marriage in exchange for you to help her immigrate in the country. Where is this taking advantage coming from?
Well, usually they marry him just for the time being, so just for those 90 days she's willing to, or he is willing to have a commitment, and after that they separate, right? So it's basically just taking advantage of the other person.
Oh, so you're talking about women taking advantage of men.
Not necessarily, it can be
Alright.
both sides. It depends, right?
Okay.
On from which who wants to get into the other country.
Okay, but yeah, so going back to the motion, I agree, as far as I know, that's the premise of the 90 days fiancé. But we're talking about importing brides, right? So that's an important distinction. So we're talking about women who are going to certain countries because of those things. So I think that taking advantage argument does come here, but I think you want to think about it a bit differently. So anyone else, how can you think, why would someone be taking advantage of those brides, and what is the mechanism? Anyone else before I go to Dasha? Or?
Because it's not, even if we say it's consensual, we can't actually say it's consensual because the woman is in a more vulnerable position since she needs to be hard and to escape from like a bad environment, but the man only needs a wife. So there's a power imbalance that basically can lead to this exploitation and advantage.
Okay. Yes. What is the crucial part of this argument? So this is about talking about power imbalance. By the way, Dasha, which type of freedom this is?
Isn't it? The domination.
Yes, non-domination. Right? So freedom is non-domination. This is what we're talking about here. Okay, so what's the crucial part here? What do you have to prove in this argument so that you convince the judge that what Dasha is talking about is actually true?
There is an actual imbalance in the power.
Yes, and how do you prove that? What do we talk about here?
You maybe frame it in a way, how does the bride live and how does the groom live? So in
Yeah.
terms of like social background and financial background, you maybe characterize them in a sense of like the groom has the ability to choose whoever he wants to import that. If for a bride, this is like a one-time opportunity to
Okay.
get out of the situation.
I think we never talk about what's actually at stake here, in the sense of for the male who actually sponsored this, what's at stake at most is his money. On the other hand, when it comes to the woman, this, as Nika has mentioned, is her one-time opportunity to change, and without the help of the man, she's actually helpless in this new country, which means that there is principally a power imbalance.
Okay, I think those are all good things. One thing that I'm looking for specifically, what does the motion, the info slide says? What does this tell us? That, you know, bride importing is where a man agrees to pay a woman and sponsor immigration into his country. What is inherent in this relationship that leads to an imbalance that you guys touched on but didn't explicitly say?
That he has certain rights in the country, like probably a citizen, and she's probably not going to be.
Yes.
The fact that go to this country.
Yes, another thing,
She's
which is,
valuable.
yes, yes, that's all the things that are true. Actually, we were coming back to that. But there is one thing also. It is that she wants to go to his country, and his country is the better country from her subjective perspective. Meaning, and you need to be explicit about that. So I think, Nika, what you're talking about touches that, but you want to be explicit about what you're trying to do here, right? And you're trying to tell me that they're doing this because it's imbalanced in favor of the man in this situation, of the one who imports the bride, because he inherently is in a country that the woman wants to move to and not the other way around. Right? Coming back to 90 days fiancé actually, in this way. Okay, so what I say in the back row, I think, so we talked about dependence, and Dominic, you also talked about how she moves to his country and how, you know, what are the implications of that. So what's the principal layer? If we try to build it out of those bits, what's principally bad about a woman moving to a guy's country? What are the things she might lack that make this a powerful, unbalanced relationship? In addition to financial independence, we already mentioned that. So, you know, most likely the guy is going to have more money. What are other things that we usually don't know in that case?
Language barrier.
Yeah, so language barrier, right? So usually if you immigrate to a country, especially if you immigrate in situations like that, because in many cases those are like Southeastern Asian women, or in many cases those are like Eastern European women, right, that we talk about, and, you know, you don't necessarily know the language of the country that you're moving to, right? So this is another way that it's an imbalance. So yeah, I think those are good ideas, and this is then the second layer of the principle. Why? Because what we were talking about earlier this is what happens before the woman comes to the country. What happens here is what is happening when she is already in the country and why she cannot easily, escape from a relationship, why this relationship cannot easily be fixed. Okay, so this is all about freedom as non-domination. Any other takes on principles in this debate? All as well. Yeah.
I mean, on opposition, I had firstly that it is a consensual choice and that we shouldn't limit people because two people consented to, like, both these people have certain needs and they managed to sort of synchronize them so both of them will benefit from it. And this has to do, I think, with positive freedom, so we shouldn't limit people and, like, their choices.
Positive freedom.
I think a positive freedom.
Right. So, you should not impose, because why? Right? Because you shouldn't impose constraints on a consensual choice between two individuals. So this is why I talk about here about negative freedom, right? Because it's about whether we should interfere with the choice, whether we should interfere with something that's going on or not. This is why this is about negative freedom rather than about positive freedom, right? So this is a negative freedom argument. Cool. Okay. So thinking about principles, do we have any reasons to say, okay, so first of all, I think there is one layer for principle here as well, where we can talk about how, even though the women, so responding to Dasha, might agree to those things, might agree to what says in the contract, and might realize the negative consequences that are coming from it, they might still not want to do, they might still have limited freedoms in terms of that they might not be able to materialize the freedoms they would otherwise be afforded, right? So if you move to a different country because you don't know the language, because you're dependent on the man, you might not also just be able to exercise the basic freedoms you have or basic rights you have elsewhere, which is why also your positive freedom argument can be made into opposition, or at least more like an interpretation of rights as a positive one rather than negative, not so much as negative freedom. Positive freedom, sorry. Okay, so how does this help us with consequentialist arguments? Yeah?
Maybe I'd say that in opposition, when you talk about like practical arguments, you would talk more about the fact that the woman's life probably in her previous country was harder, and this is a way for her to escape that, and how like this new life would be better for her, so she's actually doing something that benefits her. And then proposition to talk about how she's going to be harmed in this new country because of the fact that she can't probably get a job because she doesn't know the language and all of these things. And yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think those are 2 points that you certainly make. How do they tie back to principles? How do principles help us with making those points? Right, so what the debate is about. So in first proposition, we expect to hear a speech about outlining the case of your side, right? In second speech, you want to hear a deepening of your side, and you want to hear explanations and responses to the opposing team, right? So whether you're on top or not, doesn't matter. In third speeches, what we want to hear is why you think your side is winning the debate, or better, how you are winning the debate. So explaining to me clashes and how in different questions you are the superior side. And then replies to summing up. And I think that, thinking about it in this way, this is where principles must come into play. Why? Because you want the principles to be one of the things that is discussed at the end of the debate, and it's one of the things that in third speeches is going to be one of the clashes that you want to be winning, or that you are winning, so that you can win the debate overall. So when you think about it this way, then you want to think about what are the most important things here, in your practicals as well, so that they fit in with the whole perception of your case. Right? Your case ideally should have a theme line, which doesn't have to be explicit, it doesn't have to be said out loud. Usually it's beneficial, sometimes it's called stance, right? And it's just good to say, so for example, on prop, we are talking about dependence. So women are dependent, and that's why we don't like this, both on principle level and on practical level. Because on practical level, we can talk about different harms that exist here. So what are the harms that exist and coming from dependence on proposition? Last row. Anyone? So what happens if, you don't have, you're dependent on someone else about all the things we were talking about earlier, what are the potential harms of that? What are the bad things that happen?
He might force you into doing something. So it means that if you don't do it, he won't sponsor you anymore.
Yeah.
Basically blackmail.
Yeah. Okay, anything else?
Like he would limit your choices to do what you want.
Give it some choices. Okay.
Breaking out the issues on the pathways in the marriage and trust issues with the family.
That's an important one. So what Dominic said, I'm not sure if everyone heard. So it's about, you know, it's about the woman not being able to leave the marriage if she's unhappy with it. And this is an important question in this debate, right? Because obviously this is one of the stakeholders, one of the questions that both sides need to address, right? So what happens in abusive relationships? Because obviously, even reading the info slide, and, you know, imagining 90 Days Fiancé, right? We can see lots of the things, how this can go bad, what are the potential negative consequences. So how do we leave? Okay. Yeah, so I think that, like, you know, I think that here, this shows like in what ways you want to think about those consequences, in what ways you want to approach constructing the consequentialist argument. And they are, at the end of the day, coming from the philosophical, you know, idea that we picked on how we are going to argue the principle. Because ultimately, those are the most important things. Just, you know, an obvious disclaimer, this doesn't mean that you cannot run other arguments that don't fit in with that. Do that. If you have more arguments, that's also great. But, like, you know, just be aware of that this can help you having a more coherent vision of a case, a more coherent case development, and at the end of the day, you know, it makes a more convincing case then. But obviously, it's good to cover as much of the scope as well. Okay, on the other side, what are we talking about? So negative freedom. So, you know, unnecessary constraints, what that we are talking about. So one way, as Dasha mentioned, is you have more trouble to escape very unsatisfying life that you are living in the status quo, and you know this is something that we obviously don't want because it's really bad for lots of women, and this is, you know, better to have this option even if it's not perfect. What else can we say in opposition? Maybe philanthropic.
Besides the escape thing,
Yeah.
then it might happen, I mean that it will still happen, but illegally, and that it's better when you actually, it happens legally because it will be more regulated, but if it happens illegally, then the more vulnerable person will always be probably taken advantage of more, because there's all, like,
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that, yeah, this is the second thing that I was looking for. And it ties back to the principle as well, right? Because if we think about it, this is about showing the harms of unnecessary external constraints, right? Because when we add unnecessary external constraints, we don't actually, as Prof claims, help people, but in opposition, you can make the argument how you actually make the situation worse, not only by cutting the option away, but because the remaining options that are there are going to be just of worse quality for the people involved. Right, so, you know, this is just what I want to emphasize here, that we can think about principles, we can think about arguments more like coherently, using philosophy also for the practical arguments. And I think for those of you guys who are interested in philosophy, I think this is where the debate helps with philosophy, right? Because it's much easier, or it makes it more explicit, how we need to make also practical arguments and illustrations, not only abstractions that we usually dabble in philosophy. So, for example, for me, when I was doing philosophy in high school, one of the things that, you know, it took me a while to get a grip on was how to illustrate the abstract points in a way that make the case clear, because, you know, this is objectively hard. And I think that this is something that debate is very helpful in, because it forces you to think on both levels, and it forces you to think about those implications as well. Okay, cool. Anyone wants to add anything to the table or to the? Yeah.
Maybe a couple point on opposition that they have a positive freedom in countries, for example, where there are more men than women. So these men have a positive freedom to actually marry someone.
Okay. Okay, I think that, you know, I like spicy arguments. I think that this is certainly one of those. So I think there are two things about this argument. I think that this is certainly an argument. It can be a logically valid argument. So I think that you can construct a reason why this might be the case. I think that for me, two issues with this argument. One, I think it's just really hard to explain why the rights of those men matter more than the rights of the brides we're talking about, right? Because the debate is ultimately about weight. So we need to look at who is in the more vulnerable position, who we need to protect more, stuff like that. So this is my first thing. I think just secondly, I think that at the end of the day it's less important than other arguments because of that, right? Because it's not the crucial stakeholder, it's not the main thing we want to talk about. I would say it takes secondary place in the debate, although I do encourage creativity, so glad we had one like that. Okay, any other ideas? No? Cool. So, this is another one of those